Off-grid family vanished in 1996. Maggots at old cabin reveal the truth 10 years later. In 1996, the Thompson family made a bold decision. After years of living in a busy city and feeling overwhelmed by the noise and fast-paced life, they decided to leave it all behind. John, the father, was a hardworking man who had always dreamed of a simpler life, one that allowed him to be closer to nature. Marie, his wife, shared the same dream. Their children, Emily and Josh, were still young but full of curiosity, and they often listened to their parents talk about living off the grid, away from the chaos of modern life. The Thompsons had saved for years, preparing for this moment. John spent his free time reading survival guides, learning how to grow food, chop wood, and build things with his hands. Marie learned about herbal medicine, food preservation, and how to care for animals. Emily and Josh were homeschooled, their education revolving around the outdoors and the survival skills they would need in their new life. After much planning and anticipation, they packed up their belongings and left behind their small suburban home. The family moved to a remote cabin in the woods of Oregon, far away from the nearest town. It was a decision that many of their friends and family questioned. Why would they leave behind the comforts of modern life, with electricity, running water, and easy access to stores and services? But for the Thompsons, the idea of living in harmony with nature was too appealing to pass up. Their new cabin was old and isolated, but it had everything they needed to survive. The surrounding forest was lush, with towering trees, streams, and wildlife. The air was fresh and the sky was clear. The Thompsons quickly settled into their new life, growing vegetables in the garden, raising chickens for eggs, and fishing in the nearby streams. They spent their days outside, working together as a family. The cabin became their sanctuary, a place where they could be free from the pressures of the world. At first, the transition was exciting. Every day brought a new challenge, a new lesson to be learned. They enjoyed the simplicity of their routine. John worked on repairing parts of the cabin, while Marie took care of the animals and cooked meals from scratch. Emily and Josh, though they missed their old friends, embraced the adventure and found joy in the little things, playing in the woods, building forts, and learning to identify different plants and animals. However, as time went on, things began to change. The excitement of the new lifestyle started to fade. The isolation began to take its toll. Although they had left the chaos of the city behind, they could not escape the harshness of living in the wild. The winters were cold, and the summers brought swarms of insects. The work was never-ending, and the family was constantly on edge, worried about having enough food and firewood to survive the next season. Marie began to show signs of stress. The isolation, combined with the difficult living conditions, wore her down. She missed the convenience of modern life, the ability to pick up the phone and call a friend, or to run to the store for something they had run out of. But she never complained. John, too, began to show signs of frustration. The pressure of providing for his family in such a remote area where resources were scarce began to get to him. The work was harder than he had anticipated, and every small setback felt like a failure. Despite the difficulties, the Thompsons kept pushing forward. They had made their choice and they were determined to make it work. But as the months passed, something shifted within the family. The once strong bond that held them together began to fray. John and Marie started arguing more, and the children became restless. Emily, in particular, felt the weight of the isolation. She was a teenager now, and she longed for the friendships and activities she had left behind. Josh, though younger, also began to show signs of discontent. He often asked when they could return to the city, and he spoke of all the things he missed: his old school, the toys he had left behind, and the games he used to play. Despite these challenges, the family continued to live in the cabin, hoping that things would improve with time. They worked harder and tried to make the best of their situation, but the sense of peace they had once felt began to fade. They no longer found joy in the simplicity of their lives. The isolation that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. Then one day something happened that would change everything. The Thompsons vanished. No one knew where they had gone or why. The cabin, once bustling with activity, sat abandoned. The garden was overgrown, the animals had been left behind, and the house stood in complete silence. The family had disappeared without a trace. At first, friends and family thought it was just another one of the Thompsons' many adventures. Maybe they had gone on a camping trip or decided to move to a different location. But days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of the family. Concern grew, and a search was launched. Neighbors, friends, and even local authorities combed through the area, searching the surrounding woods and trails. But there was no sign of the Thompsons. As the weeks passed, the search grew colder. No one knew where they had gone or why they had left. Some speculated that they had gotten lost or met with an accident in the wilderness. Others believed that the family had been in over their heads and had struggled to survive. Still, there were those who whispered about foul play, suggesting that someone else might have been involved in their disappearance. The investigation dragged on, but as the years passed, the case began to lose momentum. No new leads were found, and the Thompsons were slowly forgotten by most. They became a mystery, a story that people would talk about in passing but quickly forget. Their cabin, once full of life and promise, stood as a silent reminder of their disappearance, the only trace of their existence. But the truth of what had happened to the Thompsons would remain hidden for years to come, waiting to be uncovered when no one expected it. For 10 years, the disappearance of the Thompson family remained one of the most puzzling mysteries in the small town of Willow Creek. People still whispered about the family, but as time passed, the case faded into the background. The once vibrant search efforts had long since stopped. Despite the initial shock, life in the town had moved on. Businesses had opened, people had moved away, and the memories of the Thompsons began to blur with the passage of time. John and Marie Thompson had made their choice to live off the grid, and when they vanished, most of the community assumed that they had chosen to live out their lives in isolation. Perhaps they had simply left the area without informing anyone, continuing their off-grid existence somewhere else. There were many who believed that the family had tired of society's expectations and had disappeared into the wilderness to live a life completely free of the constraints of modern civilization. For the first few years, rumors circulated about the Thompsons. Some said they had decided to start fresh in a different part of the country, choosing a more secluded location, far away from the hustle and bustle of the world. Others whispered that they had encountered some kind of accident. Perhaps they had gotten lost in the forest, or maybe a wild animal had attacked them. There were also darker rumors suggesting that foul play was involved, but all of these speculations came to nothing. With no concrete evidence, no clues, and no bodies found, the case began to grow colder. As the years rolled by, the Thompson family's story became less of a mystery and more of a local legend. Their cabin, once a symbol of the family's dreams, stood abandoned in the woods, surrounded by overgrown trees and creeping vines. The house seemed to fade into the background, blending with the forest that had slowly begun to take over it. The windows were covered with dust and grime, and the roof had started to show signs of decay. The garden, which had once been lush with vegetables, was now choked with weeds. The chickens had long since disappeared, and the few remaining traces of the family's life were the forgotten belongings scattered throughout the cabin. In the nearby town, a few people still remembered the Thompsons, mainly the older residents who had known the family before they left. Some recalled how the family had seemed so hopeful when they first moved to the area, full of excitement about starting a new life. The Thompsons had talked about their plans to live sustainably, growing their own food, raising animals, and becoming part of the natural world. But now, their story was just another mystery. The town moved on, and the house in the woods was left to slowly fall apart. Yet for some, the mystery of the Thompsons' disappearance never quite left their minds. A few people remained curious about what had really happened, but there was no way of knowing. The search parties that had combed the woods in 1996 had found no trace of the family. There had been no footprints, no signs of struggle, no broken branches, or anything that could suggest what had occurred. The Thompsons had simply vanished like shadows in the night. As the years passed, life in the small town of Willow Creek grew quieter, and the mystery of the Thompsons became a footnote in the town's history. People still spoke of them occasionally, especially when the topic of off-grid living came up. Some had even suggested that the family had deliberately chosen to disappear, perhaps finding peace in their seclusion. But as the years stretched on, the truth of what had really happened seemed more and more distant. Then, in 2006, a new family moved into the area. The Benson family, eager to escape the busy city life, had decided to start fresh in the rural town. They had heard about the cabin in the woods and thought it would be the perfect place to build a homestead of their own. The cabin, though old and weathered, seemed like a good starting point. The land was fertile, and the forest surrounding it was beautiful. It was a place where they could build a life, free from the distractions of modern living. The Bensons knew about the Thompsons' disappearance. Everyone in town had heard about it, but they were not concerned. To them, the cabin was just a house that needed some work. They were not interested in the past, they were focused on their future. They were excited about the prospect of a new life, away from the noise of the city. The old cabin became their new home, and they quickly got to work clearing out the weeds, repairing the roof, and making the space livable. But as they began to clear the cabin, something unusual happened. At first, it seemed like any other old house that needed some fixing up, but as they moved deeper into the structure, they started to notice strange things. The dust and debris were thick, as expected in an abandoned house, but there was something odd about the way the wood had aged. The floors creaked, but some areas seemed to be in worse shape than others. In one particular corner of the cabin, they noticed a small section of the wall that appeared to be oddly stained, as though something had leaked behind it. Curious, they decided to investigate further. After carefully removing the stained wood, they discovered a hidden room. It was small, barely large enough for a person to stand in, but it was there. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the room was dark and damp. The Bensons weren't sure what they had uncovered, but they knew something wasn't right. As they moved further into the room, they found something that made their stomachs turn. In the corner of the room, a suitcase lay half open. It was old, the leather cracked and faded. The family members felt a chill run down their spines as they approached it. Inside, they found a few articles of clothing, some personal items, and a photograph of the Thompsons. It was a faded picture, but it was unmistakable. The faces of the Thompsons, smiling, standing together as a family. But what they found next sent shivers down their spines. The suitcase seemed to be sitting on top of a pile of something that looked strange, almost like a dark, sticky substance. Upon closer inspection, they realized what it was. The remains of something, or someone, had been hidden away in the small room left to decompose in secret. The discovery was horrifying. It was clear that the family had not simply left or started a new life as many had assumed. Something had happened in that cabin, something tragic that had been concealed for all those years. The Bensons were stunned. They didn't know what to think or what to do. The discovery was too overwhelming, and they immediately contacted the authorities. The mystery of the Thompsons, it seemed, was far from over. The authorities arrived at the cabin in a flurry of activity. The discovery made by the Benson family was unlike anything anyone had expected. What had once been thought of as a simple family disappearance had now turned into a grim and haunting mystery. Officers and investigators combed through the cabin, looking for any further clues that could explain what had happened to the Thompson family. The discovery of a hidden room, with the unsettling evidence left behind, raised more questions than answers. What had really occurred here all those years ago? The small, hidden room in the back of the cabin became the focal point of the investigation. It was clear that it hadn't been touched for many years. The dust and decay in the room were overwhelming, and the smell of death still lingered in the air. Officers wore protective gear as they sifted through the room, carefully cataloging what they found. The suitcase with the family's belongings was placed in evidence bags, and the photograph of the Thompsons was examined. It was a simple, faded picture of the family together, but it was enough to confirm the connection to the missing family. The most disturbing discovery, however, came after a closer examination of the dark, sticky substance that had been hidden beneath the suitcase. The medical examiner was called in to assess the situation, and after a thorough investigation, it was confirmed that the remains they found belonged to the Thompson family. But what did this mean? How had they ended up in this hidden room, decaying in secret for all those years? The remains were not in one piece but fragmented. The family had clearly been hidden away after their death, and over the years, the decomposition process had taken its toll. The authorities were unable to immediately identify the cause of death, but they knew that this was no accident. Something had gone terribly wrong in that cabin, something that led to the family's tragic demise. The investigators were left with more questions than answers. Why had the Thompsons hidden themselves away? Why had they chosen such a secretive way to deal with their deaths? The family's decision to vanish into the woods had seemed like an attempt to escape the pressures of society, but this discovery painted a far darker picture. They hadn't just disappeared, they had been trapped in a nightmare. As the news of the discovery spread, the town of Willow Creek was shaken to its core. People who had lived in the area for years were stunned. They had all heard the rumors of the Thompsons' disappearance, but no one had expected this. The community had long since moved on, believing the Thompsons had simply left and started a new life somewhere else. Now, the reality was much darker. The town was left grappling with the unanswered questions of what had happened to the family. The local authorities launched a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding the Thompsons' death. Theories began to surface. Some believed it was a tragic accident, a family that had become lost or trapped in the wilderness. Others suggested that it had been a deliberate act, perhaps a final decision made by John Thompson, who had struggled with the pressure of living off the grid. But no one knew for sure. The more the authorities investigated, the more disturbing details emerged. It seemed that John Thompson had been struggling with his own demons in the months leading up to the family's disappearance. Neighbors and former friends recalled conversations in which he had expressed his frustration with the isolated lifestyle. He had been worried about the difficulties of living off the grid, the strain of providing for his family in such a remote and harsh environment. Some believed that he may have been battling with depression, and that these feelings had led him to make drastic, tragic decisions. As the investigation continued, the authorities discovered that the family had been living in increasing isolation. They had stopped contacting friends and family long before they disappeared completely. Their last few letters had been strange and vague, expressing a sense of weariness and longing for the world they had left behind. It seemed that the Thompsons' dream of a peaceful, self-sufficient life had slowly turned into a nightmare of isolation, fear, and uncertainty. But despite these revelations, there was still much that didn't make sense. Why had they hidden the remains in such a secretive way? Why hadn't they reached out for help? Was there some sort of tragic event that led to their deaths, or had the isolation and harsh conditions simply become too much for them to bear? The answers remained elusive. For the Bensons, the discovery of the hidden room and the remains of the Thompsons was a shock that they couldn't easily forget. They had moved to the area to escape their own troubles, hoping for a fresh start in a quiet, peaceful place. But now, the cabin that had seemed like the perfect retreat had turned into a haunting reminder of the darkness that could be hidden in even the most idyllic settings. The Bensons couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions, sadness, fear, and confusion, as they processed what they had uncovered. They had unwittingly become part of the Thompsons' story, forever connected to the mystery of what had happened in that cabin. It was a burden they hadn't anticipated, but they knew that they had to see the investigation through. They couldn't simply walk away and forget about what they had found. As the weeks passed, the investigation continued, and the authorities pieced together more information. They spoke to former neighbors, friends, and acquaintances of the Thompsons, trying to build a clearer picture of what had happened. Theories continued to circulate, but no one could say for certain what had led to the family's tragic end. Theories of accidental deaths, self-inflicted wounds, and even outside involvement swirled in the town, but none of them had solid evidence to back them up. The Thompsons' story, once a symbol of hope and freedom, had now become a tale of loss and mystery. The truth seemed to be buried deep within the walls of the cabin, hidden away for years. But with every passing day, the answers seemed to grow further out of reach. In the end, the Thompsons' story became a cautionary tale. The dream of living off the grid, of escaping society's pressures, had turned into a tragic nightmare. For the Bensons, and for the town of Willow Creek, the legacy of the Thompsons would never be forgotten. Their story was a reminder that even in the most peaceful and isolated places, darkness could lurk just beneath the surface. As the investigation into the Thompsons' deaths continued, the details of their last days slowly began to surface. The authorities, now deeply involved in the case, tried to piece together what had happened to the family during their final moments in the cabin. Every clue seemed to lead to more questions, and the answers were elusive. Despite their best efforts, it was clear that the family's story had ended in a way no one could have predicted. Forensic experts worked tirelessly to analyze the remains that had been found in the hidden room. The decomposition had taken years, and the condition of the remains made it difficult to determine a clear cause of death. However, the medical examiner's team was able to confirm one thing: the Thompsons had not simply died of natural causes. The circumstances surrounding their deaths were far more complex than anyone had imagined. As the team examined the family's remains, they found something unsettling. John Thompson, the father, seemed to have died first. His remains were the most decayed, and the physical evidence suggested that he had been dead for several months before the rest of the family. Marie, his wife, appeared to have died shortly after him, and the children, Emily and Josh, had died last. This timeline raised even more questions. How had they survived after John's death? Had they been alone in the cabin for months, struggling to survive without their father? Or was there something more to their deaths, something that had driven the family to make desperate decisions? The investigators soon learned that the Thompsons had not just been struggling with the challenges of living off the grid. They had been facing deep personal turmoil. Several people who had known the family before their disappearance reported that John had become increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to their move. He had always been a strong, confident man, but the isolation of the woods had begun to take its toll. He had struggled with the demands of living in such a remote location, and it seemed that the pressure had become too much for him. Marie, his wife, had tried to stay optimistic, but even she had started to show signs of stress. Her letters to friends and family had become less frequent and more strained. She spoke of missing the conveniences of modern life, things that they had once taken for granted, like hot showers and fresh food from the store. But in her letters, she also spoke of her love for John and her children. Despite the challenges they faced, she was determined to make their dream of living off the grid work. As the months passed, it became clear that the family was struggling to adapt to their new lifestyle. The cabin, though charming in its simplicity, was also difficult to maintain. The winters were harsh, and the summers brought swarms of insects and the constant need for food preservation. The Thompsons had not been prepared for the level of isolation they would experience. The loneliness was overwhelming, and as the seasons passed, the weight of it all seemed to break the family down. One of the most haunting discoveries made by the investigators was that the Thompsons' supplies had run out long before they died. There was no sign of recent food storage or any signs that they had been able to procure enough supplies to sustain themselves. It was clear that they had been struggling to survive in the wilderness. How had they managed to live for so long with so little? Were they too proud to ask for help, or had they simply believed that they could make it through on their own? The authorities also found evidence that the family had attempted to make their situation work. They had tried to hunt and fish, but there was no record of any significant success. The animals in the area were difficult to track, and the food sources were unreliable. What had started as a hopeful adventure had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. The Thompsons' dream had turned into a nightmare, but they had kept trying, perhaps out of stubbornness, perhaps out of love for each other. The most perplexing part of the investigation, however, was the hidden room in the back of the cabin. Why had the Thompsons chosen to hide their remains? Why had they gone to such lengths to conceal the truth about their deaths? Some investigators theorized that they had done so out of fear. Perhaps they had been trying to protect themselves from something, whether it was the harsh reality of their situation or something more psychological. Others believed that they had simply wanted to keep their deaths private, to maintain the illusion that they were still living their dream of a self-sufficient life, even in the face of death. Forensic experts and investigators also discovered that the family had made attempts to write down their experiences, leaving behind journals and letters that chronicled their journey. These writings were heartbreaking to read, revealing a family that had once been filled with hope but had slowly grown more desperate as the months passed. John's writings, in particular, were filled with frustration and anxiety. He spoke of his failure to provide for his family, of his doubts about the dream they had once shared. Marie's letters, while still hopeful, showed signs of exhaustion. She spoke of missing her old life, but she also talked about the joy she found in the small moments with her family. As the investigation continued, the truth behind the Thompsons' disappearance slowly became clearer. It was no longer just a mystery about a family that had vanished. It was a story of survival, of love, and of loss. The Thompsons had not chosen to disappear. They had been trapped in a cycle of desperation that had ultimately led to their deaths. They had lived in the woods for years, but it was clear now that they had not been living the peaceful life they had envisioned. Instead, they had been fighting to survive in an environment that was far harsher than they had ever anticipated. The discovery of their hidden remains, though tragic, was a final clue in the puzzle of their lives. It revealed the true extent of the Thompsons' struggle, but it also raised even more questions. Why had they chosen to conceal their deaths? Had they known that they were not going to make it? Had they accepted their fate and chosen to die alone, in isolation, rather than seek help? The answers were still elusive, but the investigators were determined to uncover the truth. They knew that they had to honor the Thompsons' memory by revealing what had happened to them, no matter how painful the truth might be. The family's story, which had once been a symbol of hope and independence, had now become a reminder of the harsh realities of life in the wilderness and of the human need for connection and support. As the case moved forward, the authorities focused on finding the answers to the questions that remained. The Thompsons' deaths had become a tragic tale, but it was also a story of resilience, a story of a family that had tried to make the impossible work. Their dream may have ended in tragedy, but their story would live on, a reminder of the dangers of isolation and the importance of community. As the investigation into the Thompsons' deaths neared its conclusion, the authorities found themselves grappling with the complexity of the case. The answers to what had happened in the cabin remained incomplete, but the fragments of information gathered painted a chilling picture of a family caught between their dreams and harsh reality. The small community of Willow Creek, once so distant from the Thompsons' tragic tale, now found themselves haunted by the memories of a family that had vanished without a trace. Though the Thompsons' disappearance had been discussed by many over the years, it wasn't until the Benson family discovered the hidden room that the investigation truly gained traction again. People in Willow Creek had gone on with their lives, but there was an underlying sense of unresolved curiosity about what had really happened. Everyone had assumed the Thompsons were just another family who wanted to escape society and had found solace in isolation. But now, with the hidden room and the family's remains uncovered, the mystery that had once seemed like a sad but ordinary disappearance had grown into something far darker. The most devastating part of the investigation was the realization that, in the end, the Thompsons had tried to survive on their own without reaching out for help. Their isolation, which had once been chosen freely, had become a prison they could not escape. The dream of living off the grid, of being free from the constraints of modern life, had ultimately turned into a nightmare. The family's decision to live alone in the wilderness had been made out of love for each other and a desire for peace, but in their final months, it seemed that peace had eluded them. As the investigation continued, the authorities pieced together what little they could from the family's journals and letters. John Thompson had been the driving force behind the family's move into the woods. He had been determined to escape the pressures of modern life and build a self-sustained home in the wilderness. But his optimism had slowly faded over time as the reality of survival set in. The pressure to provide for his family, the difficulty of living in such isolation, and the harsh conditions of the wilderness had taken their toll on him. Marie, his wife, had been the supportive partner, always trying to keep the family together, but even she had begun to show signs of struggle. The letters she had written in the months before their disappearance reflected her growing sense of isolation and longing for the comforts of their old life. But despite this, she remained dedicated to her family, always hopeful that things would improve. Emily and Josh, the children, had grown up quickly in those years, and they, too, had faced the harsh realities of their parents' dream. They had both been homeschooled and raised in the woods, away from friends and social interaction. Emily, in particular, had grown restless, longing for the friendships she had left behind. The authorities learned that, as time went on, the family's situation had become increasingly dire. The supplies they had brought with them had run out months before their deaths, and they had been forced to rely on hunting and foraging for food. But the wilderness had not been kind to them. They had been unable to find enough food to sustain themselves, and their isolation made it impossible to ask for help. By the time their deaths occurred, they had been on the brink of starvation, with little hope of surviving the harsh winter ahead. The most heartbreaking revelation was that the family had not simply died of natural causes. They had been trapped, cut off from the rest of the world, with no way to reach out for help. It seemed that John, in his desperation, had been unable to keep his family alive, and that the toll of the situation had finally driven them all to the brink. But there was more. The authorities uncovered evidence that suggested the Thompsons had known their situation was hopeless. Their final days had been filled with despair, but they had also tried to keep up the facade of normalcy. They had tried to survive, not just for themselves, but for each other until the very end. The hidden room where their remains had been concealed became a symbol of their final moments. It was as though they had wanted to keep their deaths a secret, to protect each other from the truth of their own failure. The room had been sealed off from the rest of the cabin, and their remains had been hidden away in a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of life. But in the end, it was a tragic and futile gesture. The dream of a life in the woods, the hope of living off the land, had crumbled away in the face of an unforgiving reality. As the investigation wound down, the authorities were left with one final, heartbreaking conclusion. The Thompsons had not disappeared willingly. They had not left the world behind in search of a better life. Instead, they had become victims of their own idealism, trapped in a world they had chosen, but could not survive in. The hidden room, the concealed remains, were a testament to their struggle, to their attempts to hold on to a dream that ultimately destroyed them. The Thompsons' story was one of love, of dreams, and of tragedy. Their desire to live off the grid had been born from a noble intention, to escape the pressures of society, to find peace, and to live freely. But in the end, it had been a dream too difficult to realize. The reality of isolation, of survival, had overwhelmed them. The family had faced their final days alone, without anyone to help them or to provide the support they so desperately needed. And when it was all over, they had tried to hide the truth, to protect their legacy, but the truth had come to light in the most tragic way possible. The community of Willow Creek would never forget the Thompsons. They had once been the embodiment of the dream of living freely, away from the constraints of the world. But now, they were remembered as a cautionary tale, one that served as a reminder of the dangers of isolation and the importance of human connection. The dream of living off the grid, of escaping into the wilderness, had been shattered by the harsh reality of survival. In the years that followed, the cabin stood as a quiet memorial to the family. It was eventually abandoned, left to decay just as the Thompsons had. But their story would live on, whispered from one generation to the next. It was a story of loss, of love, and of the dreams that sometimes lead us to places we cannot return from.